Imagine Australia, a truly unique nation that is also a continent itself. Its vast land is rich in natural resources, exotic flora and fauna, and stunning landscapes. Yet beneath this picturesque exterior lies significant problems that cast a shadow over the lives of its people. Despite Australia's wealth, a large portion of the population struggles to make ends meet, with inflation outpacing wages for many. As a result, many Australians find it difficult to access even basic amenities of civilized life. What led to this situation? Could it stem from the very nature of Australia itself? To understand, we must look into its history. The continent's first inhabitants were indigenous peoples, who lived here for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. They developed a rich culture, language, and traditions deeply rooted in their natural environment. However, the British colonization beginning in 1788 profoundly altered their lives. Settlers brought devastating diseases, caused conflicts, and displaced indigenous peoples from their lands. Today, Aboriginal Australians make up about 3% of the population, with many still fighting to preserve their cultural identity and secure equal rights. Most Australians are descendants of European migrants. The British and Irish migrants were the first significant wave, and for a long time the country was considered predominantly white. But this changed after the Second World War, when migration from Italy, Greece, China, India, and other nations increased. Currently, nearly one-third of Australians were born overseas. This melting pot of cultures has left the country with a truly unique atmosphere. Australians enjoy sports, barbecues, beaches, and travel, but each community contributes its own traditions, cuisine, and language, enriching the national fabric. For years, Australia remained a quiet appendage of Britain, focusing on resource exports such as gold, wool, and coal, rather than developing its own industries. Its economy depended heavily on global commodity prices, making it vulnerable during economic downturns. Additionally, the continent's geographical isolation, cut off from the rest of the world by vast oceans, complicated trade, technological exchange, and immigration. This isolation slowed industrial, commercial, and scientific progress. Over time, significant changes have occurred. Australia's economy expanded, urban centers grew, and technological advancements appeared. Still, past mistakes continue to influence current challenges. To assess what it means to be a developed country, reflect on common images. South Korea with its high-tech industries or Germany's powerful automotive sector. These examples are not misleading. A truly advanced nation is one that can produce cutting-edge innovations and push humanity forward. Yet the core measure of development lies elsewhere. How well a country can ensure its citizens access fundamental needs: food, affordable housing, quality education, effective infrastructure, and reliable transport. In essence, true modernization is reflected not just in technological accomplishments, but in a nation's capacity to provide its people with the essential comforts and opportunities of civilized life. Modern life depends on certain essentials that a person cannot do without, and Australia, as a highly developed nation, possesses nearly all of these. Yet, I mentioned almost because there remains one significant problem: affordable housing. This issue hasn't appeared overnight. Efforts to address it began as far back as the 20th century. So, what contributed to this persistent challenge? At first glance, a map of Australia suggests that its vast territory should easily accommodate everyone. but a closer look reveals a different reality. The country's landmass is comparable in size to Western Europe combined with Great Britain, which is undeniably impressive. However, its population density is only a third of that in a single London, with fewer than 4 people per square kilometer, despite the population surpassing 27 million. Several complex factors have intertwined to create this situation. Much of Australia consists of arid desert land, a consequence of its dry climate. While the country spread over an area similar to Europe, inhabitable regions are far more limited. The interior regions feature intense sunshine, water shortages, and harsh living conditions, prompting most Australians to settle along the coast. Here, the climate is milder, infrastructure is well developed, and amenities such as jobs, shops, schools, and hospitals are readily accessible. Constructing housing along the coast poses another challenge because the land there is largely owned by the government or major landholders who are not eager to sell. When they do, it's often at exorbitant prices. To understand why, we can look back into history. The gold rush of the 1850s drew thousands from around the world, eager to strike it rich. Rapid urban growth followed, yet land was plentiful, though not everyone could afford to build their own homes. Wealthier settlers bought larger plots and built spacious houses, whereas others had to make do with small wooden shacks. Property prices soared, making rent nearly impossible for many. A subsequent major crisis emerged after the First World War and during the Great Depression. The government attempted to assist veterans and their families by granting land and loans for building homes, hoping to make housing more accessible. However, the funds available were insufficient, and many loans proved unmanageable. Unemployment rose sharply, savings dwindled, and many lost their homes, ending up in slums or constructing makeshift shelters on the outskirts of towns using whatever materials were at hand. Post-Second World War, the housing situation worsened as a new wave of migrants arrived, fueling economic growth and increasing the demand for shelter. This led to a construction boom. Suburbs expanded, and new neighborhoods of private houses appeared. During this period, the Australian dream took shape. Owning a house with a garden and a fence became a national ideal. However, this promising solution faced an unexpected obstacle. Both government entities and private investors began buying land in bulk, restricting development, and implementing complex bureaucratic procedures. Securing building permits became a lengthy, complicated process, hampering the realization of the dream of home ownership for many Australians. Housing prices in Australia have been steadily climbing, fueling a surge in borrowing as people stretch their incomes to keep up with soaring costs. This has ignited a fierce competition for homes, a struggle that still resonates today. As previously noted, the country is rich in natural resources, with the nation's development largely founded on 3 key exports: coal, natural gas, and iron ore. Iron ore, in particular, played a pivotal role in Australia's economic success. Massive mining operations for iron ore began in the 1950s, attracting private companies eager to capitalize on the region's growing export opportunities, such as BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto. To put this into perspective, the amount of iron ore mined in the year 2000 was 176 million tons. By 2002, this had increased to 184 million tons. The upward trend persisted each year, driven by several factors. First, export markets. Asia's proximity made them the primary importers, led by Japan and subsequently China. Second, The mining sector's expansion created numerous jobs, drawing thousands of workers into the industry. Simultaneously, technological advancements improved extractive methods and increased production capacities. As a result, Australia's iron ore exports soared from 20% to 70% of the total, injecting vast sums of money into other sectors, such as infrastructure and education. Over time, the Australian economy evolved in line with modern trends, shifting focus from resource extraction to services. This transformation was beneficial overall. The country capitalized on its resource wealth much like Singapore did in its heyday. However, one crucial aspect remains overlooked. The influx of migrants seeking work had to settle somewhere, and Australia during that period was unprepared for such rapid population growth. Why was this the case? If we examine the global rankings of cities by housing affordability, two Australian cities, Sydney and Melbourne, appear at the top of the list of least affordable places. A significant reason for Australia's housing crisis lies in its cultural affinity for suburban living, driven by a desire for comfortable family environments outside crowded urban centers. This preference for expansion rather than density has exacerbated the problem. As population growth spreads over increasingly vast areas, reducing urban density and intensifying housing scarcity. Supporting this lifestyle, government bureaucracy further worsens the situation. Obtaining a building permit is notoriously difficult. Approvals often require navigating a labyrinth of regulations, sometimes taking weeks or even months. Even when approvals are granted, the process can involve multiple bureaucratic hurdles and endless paperwork. These administrative barriers, imposed or not, have played a role in deepening the housing crisis. One might argue this is counterintuitive, as governments are expected to support their citizens, especially in critical issues like housing. Indeed, that's true. Yet, the reality is that political decisions regarding housing have often been flawed or misaligned with the country's needs, either from the outset or over time. During the 1980s, as Australia experienced a surge in resource extraction and a growing influx of migrants, the government introduced tax incentives to encourage investment in real estate. These policies included measures like negative gearing and exemptions from capital gains tax. To understand these phenomena, consider the example of property ownership. Negative gearing allows investors to offset their expenses, such as mortgage interest and maintenance costs, against their rental income. For instance, if a property rents for $50,000 annually, but incurs $60,000 in expenses, the owner can deduct the $10,000 shortfall from their other income, reducing their overall tax burden. This effectively provides financial relief to property investors, making real estate investments more attractive. Capital gains tax applies when the value of a property increases over time. If someone buys a home for $10,000 and its value rises to $120,000, they will owe tax on the difference, $110,000, regardless of whether they made any effort to boost its value. Exemptions from this tax allow owners to retain more of their profits, encouraging holding onto property rather than selling. These benefits had a profound impact. They fueled an unprecedented boom in property lending, with investors increasingly active in the market. As their wealth grew, local residents found it harder to afford homes, intensifying housing affordability issues. In response, the Australian government provided subsidies and invested millions into direct support for citizens, a seemingly wise move that further lifted demand. Meanwhile, the supply of available homes remained stagnant, unable to keep pace with soaring demand. The core of Australia's housing crisis, however, lies in the persistently low wages. Without an income above the median, owning a property remains out of reach. Some might suggest working harder or longer hours, but real wage growth had essentially stagnated since 2009. For example, in Sydney, purchasing an average home requires an annual income of approximately $280,000, yet the typical family earns only around $120,000 a year, less than half of what's needed. As a result, many people fall into an endless cycle of saving, but due to limited supply and rising prices, they can never accumulate enough to buy. This imbalance is worsened by continual migration. In 2023, over 700,000 new arrivals moved to Australia, seeking better lives. These newcomers also need housing, further driving up demand and exacerbating the shortage. Despite the apparent prosperity, the reality is that many Australians face a stark and increasingly unbridgeable gap between earnings and housing costs, leaving many trapped in a difficult and uncertain future. The real estate market and rental services are increasingly resembling a high-stakes auction. Those encountering the most difficulties are often first-time buyers and renters who struggle to navigate this competitive landscape. Meanwhile, homeowners tend to be reluctant to part with their properties, and even when they are open to selling or leasing, they often inflate their asking prices to exorbitant heights. This tendency contributes to market stagnation as the overall turnover slows dramatically. In 2023, approximately 170,000 homes changed hands, the lowest figure for at least a decade. Income inequality across Australia is glaring and growing rapidly. Only a tiny fraction of the population controls the bulk of the nation's wealth, highlighting a widening gap between the rich and the poor. This disparity not only underscores the imbalance of financial assets, but also makes it nearly impossible for less affluent individuals to build wealth or contribute meaningfully to the country's economic prosperity. Such inequality hampers collective progress and development. Australia is often compared to Canada, two vast nations rich in natural resources with low population density and robust economies. Throughout the 20th century, both countries developed similarly by relying heavily on resource exports, attracting migrants and building towns designed for countryside living. However, over time, their paths diverged. Canada invested heavily in urban development, promoting dense housing and actively regulating its real estate market and lending practices. The government implemented stricter controls on lending, ensuring stability and affordability. In contrast, Australia continued expanding suburban areas and incentivizing home purchases through tax benefits, which fueled the rise in property prices. Another key difference lies in industrial development. While Canada diversified its economy by advancing manufacturing sectors such as automotive and aviation industries, Australia remained heavily dependent on raw material exports and largely neglected its own manufacturing base. Canada's broader economic base allowed it to better balance growth across different sectors, whereas Australia's reliance on global commodity prices left it vulnerable to market fluctuations. Today, both nations face housing affordability issues, but the approaches differ markedly. Canada's government actively intervenes to regulate and stabilize the housing market, promoting measures intended to curb excessive price hikes. Australia, on the other hand, seems to have less control over the situation, with escalating prices creating significant challenges for residents. This crisis of expensive housing is not unique to Australia. Many countries grapple with soaring property costs. For example, in Canada's major cities like Toronto and Vancouver, housing has become a luxury beyond reach for most, forcing residents to rent for life simply because home ownership remains unattainable. Similarly, the United States and Russia deal with high property prices that pose substantial barriers even to earners with solid incomes. European nations aren't exempt either. In the United Kingdom, home ownership often involves lifelong debt, while in Germany, previously affordable real estate has experienced price surges, forcing many to compete fiercely for available apartments. Despite these widespread challenges, some countries have managed to navigate housing crises more successfully, devising strategies to stabilize markets and improve affordability, though the specific methods vary significantly from one nation to another. In Singapore, for example, the government actively promotes large-scale residential development to ensure that affordable housing is available for everyone. The goal is to make homeownership attainable at reasonable prices, creating a more inclusive and stable society. Similarly, Vienna, the Austrian capital, exemplifies a different approach, emphasizing urban planning and social housing policies that keep prices relatively manageable. The question remains, will Australia's housing market continue to be an elusive dream for many, or can it be transformed? Several potential paths forward exist. One possibility is that the government will intensify efforts to build affordable homes, a strategy already successful in some nations. If Australian authorities invested heavily in large-scale construction of inexpensive apartments, residential prices could decline significantly. Yet, such measures demand substantial funding and political resolve, which are often challenging to secure. Another avenue involves relaxing building regulations. Currently, obtaining permits for new constructions is a complex, lengthy process. Cutting through bureaucratic red tape could accelerate housing supply, increasing availability and potentially driving prices down. However, the market is largely controlled by major players who may oppose such reductions, since their interests are often aligned with maintaining higher prices. Tax reforms also present a possible solution. Implementing restrictions on property purchases by investors could improve chances for ordinary buyers, alleviating speculative demand. This might reduce artificial price surges, but it's unlikely that current property owners would favor such restrictions, fearing it could impact their investments. Emerging technologies might offer innovative solutions as well. For instance, several projects now utilize 3D printing to construct homes more cheaply and swiftly. If such technological advances become widespread, they could hold the key to resolving the housing crisis by making affordable homes more accessible. At present, wealthier individuals continue to invest heavily to grow their capital, leaving those with fewer resources struggling to make ends meet. This inequality leads to declining productivity and a weakening economy, with problems compounding over time. Modern Australia's housing challenges are the cumulative result of long-standing systemic effects. One issue has led to another, and each new problem stems from previous ones. Blaming specific parties is pointless, as the current situation has developed over decades of interconnected causes. Australia remains engaged in efforts to address a crisis that fundamentally influences its future stability and growth. The choices made today will shape the nation's prosperity for years to come.